It was a cold, gray morning when two worlds collided in a way that neither of them could ever have expected. Imagine a man with tattoos that spoke of rebellion, a leather jacket that had seen better days, and a heart hardened by years of prejudice and anger. He was a biker, but not just any biker. He was a member of one of the toughest, most notorious clubs around. A club whose motto was built on loyalty, brotherhood, and, yes, intolerance. His life was about his brothers, his bike, and his beliefs. Beliefs that left little room for those who were different, particularly people of color. His world was black and white, with no shades of gray, no room for nuance. But today, that was about to change. You see, when you live a life so entrenched in hate and division, you never think the walls you've built around yourself could ever come down. You don't expect to ever meet someone who could challenge everything you thought you knew. But that's exactly what happened when he met Malik, a man with a very different story, a man who happened to be black, but whose love for motorcycles matched his own. Malik wasn't just any rider. He was confident, calm, and strong, a force of nature on two wheels. And most importantly, he wasn't interested in judgment. He was here for the ride, for the passion of the open road. The moment they met at a roadside stop, there was an unspoken tension in the air. The biker, let's call him Jake, could feel his fists clenching, his body bracing for conflict. What could a black man know about the biker life? The world he lived in had taught him that people like Malik didn't belong in spaces like this. The road, to Jake, had always been a symbol of freedom, put only for people who thought like him, looked like him, and lived like him. And yet, there was something about Malik's presence that unsettled Jake. It wasn't anger. It was a sense of calm, something unfamiliar to him. Malik didn't engage in the same confrontational energy that Jake had been used to when dealing with outsiders. Instead, Malik smiled, offering a simple handshake, and struck up a conversation about the weather, the bikes, the ride. It was strange, almost disarming. Jake had prepared for a fight, but instead there was peace. For the first time in a long time, Jake was forced to ask himself a question he'd never considered before. What if the things I'd believed for so long are wrong over the next few days? Their paths would cross again and again. Malik didn't preach about race or try to change Jake's mind, but he did something more powerful. He showed Jake what it meant to be human, to connect with another person beyond the labels society had placed on them. They talked about bikes, about the open road, about freedom. And slowly, Jake began to notice something that had always been right in front of him. The stories of every rider were different, but the road was the same for all of them. But Jake's transformation wasn't instant. The hatred he had carried with him for years didn't just vanish in a few days. There were moments of doubt, moments when his old instincts kicked in, moments when he almost pulled away. His brothers at the club didn't make it any easier. They didn't understand why he was spending so much time with someone who didn't look like him. They questioned his loyalty, his place within the group. They scoffed at the idea that a black man could be a part of their world, and they weren't shy about making their opinions known. Still, Malik was there, patient and persistent, never forcing anything, never demanding change. He was simply living his truth, and for the first time, Jake began to see that his own truth might not be as clear-cut as he'd always believed, but just as Jake began to consider that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as divided as he'd been taught, something happened that threatened to unravel everything. The very club that Jake had once thought of as family began to turn against him. They saw his newfound friendship with Malik as a betrayal, something that couldn't go unpunished. The pressure mounted. Would Jake stand by his new friend, or would the weight of his old loyalties pull him back into the darkness he had spent so long hiding in? Jake's next decision could change everything. Would he walk away from the only world he'd ever known for the possibility of something more? Or would the old, familiar hatred pull him back, taking him down a path from which there would be no return? The tension was unbearable, the future uncertain, and Malik's quiet confidence made it clear that whatever happened next, it was all on Jake. One choice, one moment of clarity, could rewrite everything. The question now wasn't just whether Jake could change, it was whether he would. Jake sat on his bike, the engine rumbling softly beneath him, staring at the horizon as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The wind was chilly, but it felt good against his face. There was something soothing about the road, the rhythmic hum of the engine, the quiet solitude it provided. It had always been a place where he could escape from the world, a world that had never quite understood him, a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. It was just him and the road, and for years, that was enough. But now the road felt different. He had always thought he knew exactly where he belonged, that he had it all figured out. His brothers in the club, the camaraderie, the respect, it was all he'd ever needed. They shared the same loyalty to the lifestyle, the same beliefs, the same need for strength in a world that seemed to want to tear them apart. They had each other's backs, no matter what. But things were shifting now, and Jake couldn't ignore it. Malik had become more than just a passing acquaintance. There was an undeniable bond between them, built over conversations that stretched long into the night. Malik had a way of seeing the world that Jake had never considered. He didn't speak of race in a way that felt like an accusation or a lecture. He didn't preach about the things Jake's brothers often shouted about in their echo chambers. Instead, Malik talked about respect, about the power of understanding, about the freedom they both found in the wind rushing past them as they rode. Jake found himself listening, truly listening, in a way he never had before. But the more he listened, the more questions arose. How could he reconcile what Malik was teaching him with the beliefs he had spent years absorbing from his club? How could he be part of a group that treated people like Malik as lesser, and still hold on to his own sense of right and wrong? The conflict inside him was growing, gnawing at him. The easy answers he had always relied on were slipping away, replaced by uncertainty and doubt. His brothers noticed. They always noticed. When Jake showed up at their latest meetup, there was a coolness in the air that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but it didn't escape his notice. The glances, the whispers, the way they kept their distance. They had always respected him, but now it was different. It was like they could sense that something was changing, that Jake was no longer the man they had known. It wasn't long before one of them, Terry, the club's vice president, pulled him aside. "Jake," he said, his voice low, "you've been spending a lot of time with that guy. What's going on? You know what the club stands for. We don't mix with outsiders, especially not someone like him." Jake's jaw tightened. "Malik's not like them," he said, his voice firm. "He's just another rider. He gets it, just like we do." Terry's expression darkened. "No, Jake, he's not just another rider. He's a black man, and that's not something we tolerate here. You're walking a dangerous line. If you keep this up, you'll have to choose." The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on him. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. The club had always been about loyalty, about brotherhood, and now Jake was being forced to choose between that and a new understanding that was growing within him. Could he truly walk away from everything he'd ever known for something that felt so uncertain? Meanwhile, Malik was still there. Calm, steady. He never pressed Jake to make a decision. In fact, he seemed to understand that the choice was something Jake had to make on his own. But there were moments when Jake could see the weariness in Malik's eyes, the subtle way he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had lived a life where his worth was always questioned, where his mere presence in spaces like this was treated as an act of defiance. And still, he stood tall, never backing down. As the days went by, Jake found himself torn between two worlds. On one side, there was the club, the life he had known, the brothers who had stood by him for years. On the other, there was Malik, an individual who had shown him that there was more to the world than the narrow lens through which he had been taught to view it. He couldn't ignore the truth in Malik's words, but he also couldn't ignore the loyalty he felt to his brothers. The tension built, day after day. Every time he saw Malik, there was an invisible pull that drew him closer. But every time he faced his brothers, the weight of their expectations pressed down harder. It felt like the walls were closing in on him, and there was no easy way out. Then came the night that everything changed. Jake received a call from Terry, but this time, it wasn't just a casual conversation. "We know where you've been, Jake, and we know who you've been spending your time with. The club's had enough. It's either him or us." The ultimatum was clear. It was the final straw. Jake was being forced to make a choice, one that would change the course of his life forever. He sat in silence for a long moment, the phone pressed against his ear. His heart raced as the weight of the decision bore down on him. He thought about Malik, about the way Malik had taught him to see the world with new eyes, to question the things he had once taken for granted. But he also thought about his brothers, the ones who had stood by him through thick and thin. Could he really walk away from them? The clock was ticking. Jake could feel the pressure mounting. His fingers tightened around the phone, and for a brief moment, he considered ending it all right then, calling Terry, choosing the club, choosing everything he had known. But something inside him, something deeper than the loyalty he had always prided himself on, told him that he couldn't go back. Not now, not after everything he had learned. The tension in his chest grew unbearable as he finally made his decision. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward his bike. His heart was pounding, his mind racing, but his path was clear, or so he thought. The next few moments would either be his salvation or his destruction. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as he revved the engine, the familiar roar filling the air. He was on his way to meet Malik, to tell him what he had decided. It was the hardest choice he'd ever made, but it felt like the only way forward. He had made up his mind. He was going to leave the club. The loyalty, the brotherhood, the respect, it had all been overshadowed by the realization that his heart no longer belonged to that world. It wasn't the freedom of the road he was seeking anymore. It was something deeper, something more genuine. Malik had shown him a path of understanding, of seeing the world through another person's eyes, and that was a road Jake was ready to take. But as he neared the meeting spot, a sudden twist of fate slammed into him like a freight train. A group of club members was waiting for him. Terry stood at the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The other men stood behind him, their faces hard, their stances tense. Jake's stomach dropped. "You made your choice, didn't you, Jake?" Terry said, his voice cold and controlled. "We knew you were weak, but we didn't think it would come to this. You've got one last chance to make things right." Jake's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. "I made the choice that felt right to me," he said, his voice steady. "I'm done with all of this. You're not my family anymore." Terry's eyes narrowed. For a moment, everything was still, the silence between them heavy. The weight of years of friendship and loyalty hung in the air. And then, with a swift motion, Terry stepped forward. "You don't get to just walk away, Jake. Not like this." Jake didn't back down. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, but he didn't flinch. This was the moment where everything he had learned, everything he had become, was about to be put to the test. Was he really ready to stand on his own, to live a life beyond the walls of the club, beyond the hatred and division that had defined him for so long. Without warning, Terry swung at him, his fist aimed directly at Jake's face. But Jake was ready. He sidestepped, ducking out of the way just in time, his body reacting on instinct. He didn't want to fight, but he wasn't going to back down either. He wasn't the same man he had been a few months ago. This was no longer about strength or domination. It was about standing firm in the face of everything that had held him back. The other men hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had expected a battle, a fight to prove who was in control. But Jake's resolve was unshakable. This wasn't about physical strength anymore. It was about courage. It was about stepping into a new life, one that wasn't bound by old loyalties or outdated beliefs. And then, as if on cue, Malik appeared, riding in on his bike. The sight of him, so calm, so unshaken, was the final reminder Jake needed. Malik didn't say a word, but his presence was enough. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to show that there was a different way. A way of peace, of understanding, of breaking free from the things that divided them. Terry and the others stood there, staring at Malik, their confusion evident. But Jake didn't need to explain. They could see it in his eyes. They knew the man he had become. With a deep breath, Jake turned back to the group. "I'm done with this," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "I'm done with the hatred, done with the anger. I found something better. And if you can't understand that, then maybe it's time for all of us to go our separate ways." There was a long pause. And then slowly, Terry stepped back, his face a mix of disbelief and resignation. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had seen something in Jake that he couldn't deny, a strength that came not from violence, but from a quiet, steady resolve. One by one, the other members turned and walked away. The club, the life Jake had known for so long, was no longer his. The road ahead of him was uncertain, but it was his to travel now. He wasn't bound by old beliefs or allegiances. He was free. Malik rode up beside him, offering a nod of approval. No words were needed between them. They both understood. Jake had made the choice to step into a new world, a world where judgment didn't define him, where his worth wasn't measured by the color of his skin or the group he belonged to. As they rode together, the wind whipping through their hair, the sun dipping lower on the horizon, Jake felt a sense of peace he had never known. It wasn't the freedom of the open road that had changed him. It was the freedom to be who he truly was, without fear, without hatred. And in that moment, he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, but it was one he would never have to ride alone. Together, they would find a way to break the cycle of division, to show others that it's never too late to change. The world was full of possibilities, full of people waiting to be understood. And Jake, for the first time, was ready to listen.